5. Top down, bottom up, and inside out. Spend even just a minute among world builders and you'll likely hear the terms top down and bottom up. These two information processing approaches constitute the ends of extremes when it comes to world building strategy. Top-down approaches the world in terms of overview, where the underlying idea or system is formed on a grand scale, then, with all subsequent subsystems being added and refined until everything is mapped out. It is, in effect, the big picture view, wherein minor details are initially ignored in favor of big patterns, which are in turn broken down into smaller portions until everything is accounted for. Architecture employs top-down design, with the blueprints first mapping out the foundation and general size and shape of the building before delving into the nitty-gritty aspects, such as the electrical system and bathroom fixtures. In terms of world building, top-down takes an idea and then builds out from it. By way of example, a top-down world creation would start with a concept and then speculate as to the changes wrought to it by said concept. For instance, we could decide our world would be one where the ground becomes poisonous at night. With that concept in mind, we could then extrapolate the ramifications of this change, such as all creatures there needing to leave the ground at night. This could lead to a preponderance of arboreal animals, or perhaps a higher percentage of winged creatures, including humanoids. From there, we would continue this line of thinking to design the creatures of this world based upon their arboreal nature until we had all the smaller details laid out, including their diet and clothing. It should also be noted that the top-down system can incorporate multiple ideas from which to build the world out from. Bottom-up, on the other hand, deals in the granular base elements of the system first, figuring them out as needs arise, then grouping them together into larger constructs over and over until a pattern forms. Toy building blocks are a great example of bottom-up design in that the components can be assembled brick by brick until a building eventually emerges. First, one might construct a wall, and then another with a bit of embellishment, figuring out how to hook them together along the way. It is a far more organic process, with the final shape of said building not being known until the final brick is placed. In terms of world building, bottom-up is often deducted after the fact of construction. For instance, if the author wrote a scene in which elves flying on dragonback attacked a tribe of orcs at night, only for the orcs to drive them away by summoning ghosts capable of tearing a soul from a body, we could surmise the world building through the provided details. Impossible races like elves, orcs, and dragons exist, as does magic, ghosts, and the soul. With those world-building details in mind, we could then construct a unifying framework to explain these details, perhaps with two warring deities who use these hapless creatures as minions in their eternal war. In many ways, bottom-up world-building mirrors how fans deduce overarching world-building systems from the details they discover in a story. Most individuals exist somewhere in between these two extremes, and both strategies have their strengths and weaknesses. How people interact with Legos is a great indicator as to their top-down, bottom-up inclinations, with top-downers starting with the included plans and assembling the design via the instructions, whereas bottom-uppers scatter the blocks on the floor and simply start building. In terms of authors, top-downers meticulously plan out every character, plot point, and location, whereas bottom-uppers like to just write and see what comes out of it. George R.R. Martin distinguishes between the two as architects and gardeners when he said, "The architects plan everything ahead of time, like an architect building a house. They know how many rooms are going to be in the house, what kind of roof they're going to have, where the wires are going to run, what kind of plumbing there's going to be. They have the whole thing designed and blueprinted out before they even nail the first board up. The gardeners dig a hole, drop in a seed, and water it. They kind of know what seed it is. They know if they planted a fantasy seed or a mystery seed or whatever. But as the plant comes up and they water it, they don't know how many branches it's going to have. They find out as it grows. And I'm much more a gardener than an architect. 2011. In other writing circles, these two extremes are often referred to as planners and pantsers, the former outlining everything, while the latter group performs discovery writing and supposedly get through the story by the seat of their pants. These two extremes apply to authors and world builders alike. However, world building is not the domain of authors alone, and many role-playing game masters mirror this dichotomy in constructing their own worlds. Although it's unlikely that you would be reading a book on fantasy world building and not familiar with tabletop role-playing games, let's take a moment to examine them. Role-playing games are an interactive storytelling medium where a game master, or dungeon master in the Dungeons & Dragons series, controls the setting and situations where the other characters, all playing various roles, find themselves. Both sides adhere to a set of rules created by the game system, which acts as a framework for their exchange in the unfolding story. The players make decisions for their characters to interact with this situation, while the game master controls all other variables, except for the dice, which will invariably betray you. Due to the interactive nature of role-playing games, even the most meticulous and Type A game master cannot plan for all contingencies the characters will attempt. Player characters will unfailingly find a way to confound the situation, thus forcing the game master to flow with the story or else lose control of the session. Game masters, however, ultimately hold full control over the world outside of the agreed-upon rules that come with the game. In Richard Baker's World Builder's Guidebook for the second edition of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, he outlines 7 basic approaches for designing a world, the major two being the macroscopic and the microscopic. These two correspond with Chris Pramus's 2 major approaches as outlined in The Kobold Guide to World Building. Outside in, wherein the game master creates the world in a top-down manner from world to continent to kingdom until the campaign setting finally emerges, to Inside Out, page 17, which takes the opposite approach in that only what's needed for the immediate gaming session is constructed, and the game master simply adds more to the ever-expanding world as is needed for the next session. Inside Out, in effect, is staying just one step ahead of the gamers when it comes to world building. The parallels between top-down and outside-in, and bottom-up and inside-out should be obvious, but the implications of the latter cannot be overstated. This is because it focuses on the gamer rather than the game master, the audience rather than the author. The argument between top-down and bottom-up world building always concerns the method the author uses when constructing the world. However, as the inside-out approach points out, those interacting with the world do so one session at a time. The author or game master may have an expansive understanding of the world from its creation in the cosmic forge until that very moment many millennia later. But none of that matters to the players unless it impacts them in the moment. The player is mostly interested in pertinent details for that single session, which expands to encompass larger and larger areas as the game goes on. Fantasy fans mirror this inside-out gaming approach in that they encounter the created world one word at a time. Yes, the big top-down ideas such as a hidden magic school for kids can certainly attract the reader via the book's back material, but the actual world itself is experienced in the moment through immediate details, with the audience learning what's pertinent for the current story. This is then built upon to finally encompass an overview of the whole created world as the story progresses. This is possibly the greatest insight role-playing games offer to fantasy authors. That while the author may employ top-down, bottom-up, or a combination of the two strategies in creating their specific world, the audience still experiences said world from the inside out. And, as Tolkien notes, audiences will assess the effectiveness of said world building based upon their own experiences and understanding of the real world. Which leads us to the ultimate conundrum for world builders. Audience members' assessments are entirely subjective since they are based upon their personal experiences. This shouldn't be a terribly unexpected development, being as that every other aspect of the storytelling experience is also subjective. No matter how hard the author believes they've hammered home a character motivation or set up a plot twist, there are those who will say these choices were unwarranted and inexplicable. Meanwhile, there will be others who will say these moments of setup were far too telegraphed and heavy-handed. No matter what, there will be opposing camps as to the effectiveness of the work, such that those same details, those same exact words elicit entirely different responses. Tolkien's songs in The Lord of the Rings prove the perfect example, with many describing them as breathtakingly beautiful, whereas others will immediately skip them for being boring. And not only does this subjective experience and assessment mean there's massive variance within the audience as a whole, it means the subjective experience can change for the same audience member over time. What seemed like a brilliant detail to us as kids may become grating when we re-experience the same thing many years later. Tolkien himself was not immune to this mutability and stated how much he hated reading poetry in his youth and would skip poems whenever they came up in a story. What's more, the subjective audience experience is also always based on our current cultural milieu. This means not only will current social and cultural beliefs flavor audience members' subjective assessments, but the understanding of technology, science, history, and culture will shift as well. Change can come at a much different rate than authors anticipated in their speculation, especially in the realm of science fiction, where Star Trek's tricorders and communication devices now seem quaint. On the opposite end of the spectrum, 2019 has come and gone, and yet we don't have flying cars, androids, or off-planet travel as promised in Blade Runner. Ray Bradbury's tales of people living on Mars now seem overly ambitious since we've actually landed a rover on the planet to realize how inhospitable it really is. These moments where details do not conform to their time period are known as anachronisms. Anachronisms are anathema to effective world building because these incongruous details derail the immersive experience, as we'll discuss in Chapter 10. Some anachronisms are objective and easy to detect, such as the lack of Blade Runner's flying cars and androids in 2019 or Bradbury's suburban communities on Mars. However, both these examples come from the realm of science fiction, which depends primarily on the understanding of science and technology that audiences have. Fantasy anachronisms are instead primarily judged by audiences' understanding of history, which makes it a bit trickier to navigate. I'm reminded of one time on a fantasy forum where a member complained about how their immersive experience was ruined when reading a book because a character exclaimed, "Wow!" This expression was too modern, they said, even though the story takes place on an entirely different world with no connection to Earth. So I looked into the etymological history of "wow" to discover the expression dates back to 1510 Scotland. The age of this word would mean it very well could exist within the constructed world, yet when I pointed this out, the forum goer rejected my argument and simply reiterated it was too modern of a word for a fantasy setting. Any fantasy setting. The fickleness of the subjective audience experience in assessing fantasy world building is no small impediment. You can't please all the people all of the time, as the adage famously states. However, you can please many people most of the time, which is why we focus on our world-building exemplars for this book. They have pleased millions of people for decades, and from them, we can deduce some world-building best practices to implement for authors, as well as reasonable genre expectations for fantasy fans.